Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
Hey, and it is Saturday. We are talking about money. Last week I was talking about China. I talked about how that was the past, how China went from a $92 billion GDP in 1970 to over $13 trillion in 2021. In 51 years, from 92 billion to 13 trillion, 181-fold increase. The United States, by comparison, increased 21 times, from 1 trillion to 22 trillion. You know, China increased 9 times faster than did the United States. China started from a lower base, of course, so that makes it easier, but that's still a remarkable change in their GDP. And last week I talked about how that happened. They had a model. They had a model from Jean Colbert, who was the Treasury Secretary for Louis XIV in France. And the pattern was the same. In France, France was almost bankrupt. It was a backward country. It was not one of the major countries in Europe that fought 3 major wars, 2 minor wars, and the country was essentially bankrupt. But Jean-Baptiste Colbert came in and revitalized the French economy by giving royal privilege, giving companies the money to build factories, guaranteeing that the government would buy all their products, and sending around quality control teams so that they produced the very finest products in the world at that time. That was his program. And that's what he did. He built France into the economic power that they would become, and enough of an economic power that Napoleon, when he succeeded, because at the French Revolution, a lot of people lost their heads, when Napoleon came to power, he built the French Empire. And the French Empire covered almost all of Europe, what we know today as the Eurozone, all the way into Russia. That's how the Communist Party in China did it. The Communist Party had broad powers. They controlled the land. They controlled the banks. They controlled the infrastructure. They controlled foreign policy. They controlled the military. They controlled the major companies in China. They went out, like France did, and recruited entrepreneurs, recruited companies to come in, so much so that 70% of the exports from China are from companies who manufactured in China. They furnished cheap labor, just as France did. That was how China has grown their GDP 180-fold. 180-fold. Think about it, the changes that have gone on in China. And during that time, the economists called Xi Jinping the world's most powerful man, because his message going forward is to pursue the dream of rejuvenation. And what that means is rejuvenating China to become a world leader, for China to replace the United States as the world leader, both economically and militarily, to begin to rebuild the Silk Road. And I talked last week about how that had begun with 2 different things. One was the Made in China 2025. That came out of their Congress in 2017. Every 5 years, they hold a major Congress. That will be this year as well, 2022. But in 2017, they came up with the Made in China 2025. They wanted to dominate the world's high-tech industries. Their intention was to dominate the industries. Those industries are medical, computers, telecommunications, electric vehicles, advanced and basic materials, mobile devices, agricultural machinery, and robotics. They wanted to replace the United States as a leader in those fields. But that wasn't all. That wasn't all that they wanted to do. They did the Belt and Road Initiative, rebuilding the Silk Road. And if you look at the Silk Road the way it was, if I had a picture, you would find a system that looks like the highways in the state of Washington. There's highways all over the place. So it was with the Silk Road. There were multiple roads. It wasn't one road. There were multiple roads. And China is, with their Belt and Road Initiative, they want to reconstruct that. They want to do a road by sea. They want to do a belt by land. They want to control the Pacific Ocean. They want to control the Arctic Ocean. They want to control the digital Silk Road. The Silk Road on ice through the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Silk Road. That is what China is doing, and they're committing trillions of dollars to do that. That's what I talked about last week, as you recall. Countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, they're pouring tons of money into financing and helping those countries finance railroads, power stations, airports, critical elements in those countries for transportation, for communication. In Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, those are the three countries that surround China on the eastern side. Uzbekistan is a little beyond that. They're all Islamic countries. And China is trying to strengthen them economically. They're pouring money into it. They really want to strengthen them to defend China's western border, to stop any Islamic terrorism from taking hold in those countries. And they're committing trillions of dollars to do that. They're committing trillions of dollars to Africa as well. They're building roads in Liberia, for example. In Liberia, they're building roads for the plantations. Those roads get washed out every year, and so the government of Liberia has to borrow more money to rebuild a road that should have been built right in the first place. But that's the Chinese labor and the Chinese way. I mentioned Hambantota, and I mentioned that because it's typical of the Belt and Road Initiative and the reason China is doing all of this. China had, or let me back up, Sri Lanka is where Hambantota is. It's the second largest port in Sri Lanka, but it was dilapidated, it was run down, it really needed to be rejuvenated. So China offered to loan the money to Chinese companies, to loan the money to Sri Lanka to completely modernize the port of Hambantota. Sounds like a great deal, right? China's going to come in, they're going to put the money in. It's not like the United States does things with our foreign aid where we send the money to countries, never expecting it to come back to us. In the case of China, they did it in terms of loans to the government. Of course. And when the government of Sri Lanka faulted on the debt, couldn't pay the debt back, those Chinese companies repossessed the port. Today, that port is owned essentially by Chinese companies, and the government of China owns those Chinese companies, and a quarter of the Chinese Navy is harbored in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. China, realizing that it's much easier to own a country economically and to own the key parts of that country and to make vassal states out of those countries by owning the railroads, the airports, the railroads, the highways, the media stations, all of those things, power stations. If China can control those, they control the countries. They're building vassals, essentially building vassal states all across Southeast Asia into Europe. They stretch all the way to Belgium and Netherlands. So that was the focus. That's what I talked about last week. So where do things go now? How do they replace America as the world's economic power and as the military power. They've added one more aspect to it that we're going to talk about in some detail, because what they're doing has to be consistent with Chinese philosophy and the Chinese outlook. They are looking for it to be consistent with China. That's what they're looking for in everything they're doing. And that, we're going to come to a commercial break, and after we come back from the commercial break, we're going to begin to explore that and see what they're doing, because it has an impact. You started to see the impact when they withdrew the DD IPO from America. You saw that impact as the stocks dropped 40 or 50%. It's not over with. It's just beginning. And we're going to come back to that once we come to a commercial break and talk about what's happened and how it got to that point. So don't go away. We've got so much more. We've just been covering the past. Now we're going to look into the future. And that is going to be the most interesting aspect of this all. Stay with me. Where we left off, I want to readdress this whole thing. Made in China 2025. How are they moving forward on dominating the world's high-tech industries? Medical, computer, telecommunications, electric vehicles, advanced and basic materials, mobile devices, agricultural machinery, and robotics. How are they addressing it? You know, there's been a lot of questions about intellectual property. They put in high-speed trains, for example. They did a joint venture with a Japanese company. They did a joint venture with a Belgian company. Chinese had one share of the company. Those companies from those countries had an ownership. China then made a few improvements and then claimed that technology was theirs. They essentially stole all that. But if you're really going to dominate, you can't steal technology. You can't just depend upon people doing partnerships. There's already a reticence by a lot of American companies to do business in China because they're worried that their technology is going to be stolen anywhere in the world but China. That actually began to change. In 2017, going along with the Made in China 2025, they took a complete change in their intellectual property. 2017. You heard Adam Phillip was one of my guests on the program. He's been on the program a couple times. He has an office in China, and he talked about it. He talked about suing a Chinese company for patent infringement prior to 2017, and his Chinese partner said, "We're really lucky. The judge in this case has a high school education." Prior to 2017, a lot of the judges who handled intellectual property were political appointees. Not uncommon in China, by the way. And we'll talk more about that as we go further today. But they were political appointees. Didn't know anything about intellectual property, didn't know very much on technique. They weren't engineers. They were just political hacks. But in 2017, the Chinese government overhauled the intellectual property courts. Every one of the courts now has a judge who has a college education. Every one of the courts has somebody that generally has an engineering background, so they understand technology. And they're really focused because something else is happening. They wanted to develop their own intellectual property. It wasn't enough to do joint ventures with companies out of America or England or out of France, out of those countries where you have leading technology, Germany. They wanted to develop their own technology. That's the only way you're going to dominate anyway. So they began to set up patent incentives. The cost of filing a patent is now up to 85% deferred. If you want to file a patent in the United States, you're going to pay anywhere from 25 to 100,000 at the very minimum, and sometimes 250 to 300 to 400 to 500,000. In China, the government will loan you up to 85% of that cost. And what's happened is that's working. That's truly working. If you look at what's happened, the number of patents filed in China in 2010 was 30,000. And let me find my numbers. I have numbers here that I've missed. 2010, there were 30,000 patents granted to Chinese inventors. In the United States, by contrast, there were 241,977. Now, if a patent's approved today, the national government will pay you $150,000 or more to commercialize it. In addition, the state governments will pay $10,000. And then you have some cities that will also kick in money. So if you develop a patent, you get paid very well. In the United States, if you develop a patent, you've got to get it all the way to the market and then depend upon a business to make money from it. In China, just by getting a patent granted, you get a chunk of money. You can get 200,000, 150, 200,000, 500,000 paid by the government because you got the patent. And so what's happened? In 2020, in the United States, from 2010 to 2020, we went from 241,977 to 352,013 patents that were granted. In China, from 30,000 granted in 2010, it went to 2,370,000 in 2020. From 30,000 to 2.3 million in China. And those people are getting paid incentive to develop the patents. And they're getting paid to develop up in those fields. The computers, the electric vehicles, agricultural machinery, in those areas where China wants to dominate, they are pressing hard to develop innovative technology. That's their focus. That's what they want to do. But they want it to be consistent with Chinese culture. They want to regulate, they want to control, and they're concerned about cyberspace. Which brings us to the next point. Something happened in the United States which really upset the plans in China. It was a person, actually. The person was Edward Snowden. Snowden worked for the CIA. He was capable, or had the access to download national security data, and he did that. He downloaded it onto a thumb drive, and he walked away with it, thinking that he could sell that to whomever. He knew that it was extremely valuable. That proved to truly be upsetting to what China's doing. They did not want their national secrets being downloaded to a thumb drive and someone walking away. So they set up the Cyberspace Administration of China in 2014 with several departments. A Department of Internet Security, Emergency Command Center, an Agency Service Center, and get this, the Illegal and Unhealthy Information Reporting Center. Get this again, the Illegal and Unhealthy Information Reporting Center. This is what oversees their cyberspace. The person who's in charge of it is a person by the name of Lu Wei. Lu Wei, until 2016, was head of Beijing Propaganda Department. He was the one that got all the information out and showed how China was doing. He supervised 60,000 workers who were on the payroll, and another 2 million who weren't on the payroll, but who subcontracted to the Beijing Propaganda Department. And they put out some regulations and rules. And one of them that I think is really telling is this, and I quote, "The use of the standard official and authoritative media reports with regards to the detention of troublemaking lawyers by the relevant departments." You have to use the standard official and authoritative media reports in regards to the detention of troublemaking lawyers by the relevant departments. Liu Wei. Liu Wei wasn't a business person, had no business background, but he'd been in charge of Beijing's propaganda. And he set up rules to censor what goes on websites and what's transmitted in cyberspace. And the content of a website, the content of what you put out in terms of email, in terms of online marketing, it had to contain or could not contain any of the following: any information that harmed national security of China, anything that harmed China's honor or China's interest. You could not put out anything that damaged China's religious policies. You could not put out anything that spread any rumors. You could not put anything out that disturbs the public order. And you could not intentionally use character combinations to avoid censorship. Now remember, Chinese is in characters, and so if you juxtapose some of those characters, maybe you could try to get around the censorship. If you tried to do that, you were in violation, and Liu Wei was ready to take care of that. And it was in June of 2021, this past year, when things began to come apart, that they put into place the policies on sharing data, because they want data to be shared, not kept within a company, but they want social media data, e-commerce data, lending data, and all business data to be shared with companies, share it with competitors, share it with complementary businesses, and for sure, share it with the government. That's Liu Wei. His concern is that you didn't dominate data. They realized the data is like the new oil of this century. It's power. It's what you find in Facebook, in Amazon, in Apple, in all these companies. They have tremendous pools of data. That now in China has to be shared. It's not proprietary information. It has to be shared. So that's where that went. But we're not done talking about the changes that are going on. We've got more changes to talk about, so stay with me after this break. We're going to talk about the China Internet Investment Fund. Another deal for China. Stay with me. So I've been talking about China. I talked about how China in the past grew from 70 billion or 92 billion in 1970 to $13 trillion. That's the past, and that's how they got there. I talked about that. Talked about the Cyberspace Administration of China under Liu Wei. No business background, had been until 2016 head of Beijing propaganda, and put in censorship on websites. But China also realized something else was going on, because e-commerce was beginning to explode. There were private companies in China, small companies, that had grown significantly. In 2000, there were 14% of the private companies were internet companies. By 2015, there were 33. Nearly 1/3 of the private companies in China that weren't controlled by the Chinese government. The Chinese government funded the steelmakers. They funded the big companies. You can go down the list, the aviation companies. You can go down the list that they were funded and controlled completely. Others that they funded and had some control. But the internet companies, these were companies that could grow up in a person's kitchen. Write code, put it on the internet and begin to sell products. That had grown from 14% to a third of all the private companies. And China decided they needed some control over those companies. So 5 years ago, they formed the China Internet Investment Fund. Sounds like an interesting thing, China Internet Investment Fund. And it was set up so that they could buy 1% of the ownership in all internet-related companies. 1%. And it had to be a significant discount, especially for companies that had been established for a long time. Just 1% had to be deeply discounted. And there were 130,000 private and joint venture companies that fell under their jurisdiction that they own 1% of. Now, the board of directors of those 130,000 companies are a board of directors of 3 people, just 3. You don't have the 15 or 20 people or 6 or 8. The Chinese companies have 3, just 3. And the China Internet Investment Fund had the right, with their 1% ownership, to appoint one of those 3 directors. 1% ownership, they get to appoint one of 3. We have proxies. We have votes on who gets to be on the board of directors of Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or Boeing or Bank of America or any of the other companies around here, Costco. You do a vote, and the company usually proposes people they would like to have on the board of directors, and people with the shareholders vote on it, and you have to get a majority of the votes to be elected. Not in China. 1% gets you the right to appoint one director. Think about that. Think about Amazon or Microsoft or Google or Netflix or any of the other companies, Apple. If the same thing worked in the United States, they would get to appoint 1/3 of the board of directors by owning 1%. And not only that, they had the right to buy 1% of the company, 1% of the stock, for a very deeply discounted rate. They might only put in $10 or $20 or $30,000 and control 1% of the entire market cap of that company. And from that, they get to appoint 1/3 of the directors. You know how much power that gives? And the person they appoint doesn't have to have any business background. That person is appointed to make sure that those companies run along party ideology. Their big concern is not whether those companies make money or lose money. Their big concern, their big oversight, is they want to make sure that those companies do not fail to control their party ideology. They want to make sure those companies fall within party ideology. If they lose money, okay, as long as they toe the line, as long as they toe the communist line. And when you think about it, think about the board appointment to ByteDance. The appointee came in, Wu Shugang. ByteDance, of course, is a company that owns TikTok. TikTok got into the news because Facebook said that's one of their main competitors. ByteDance is the company that owns TikTok. And Wu Shugang is appointed from the Cyberspace Internet Investment Fund. He's one of their 3 directors. He had no business background, none whatsoever. He came out of the communist propaganda machine. Think about Lu Wei, head of the China administration, the Cyberspace Administration of China, the guy that came from the Beijing propaganda, no business background. Now he appoints somebody else out of that same department, Wu Shugang, no business background. And a month later, Zhang Yiming, the founder of ByteDance, steps down. Now, did he voluntarily step down? Maybe. Was it a coincidence that 1 month after a new director is appointed, he steps down? Maybe. Was it all just coincidence? Maybe. Was it the problem that TikTok was really becoming popular and that he steps down? Was it that it was becoming too popular? Was it becoming something that was outside of party control and he needed to step away? Maybe. Who knows? But he's replaced by Lang Rubio, who was the head of the HR department at ByteDance. That's what's going on in China. That is the way that the Chinese government is moving, and because China controls the banking, they control finance, they control the land, they control the infrastructure, they control the foreign policy, they control the military, and they now control the internet businesses. They want to build the cyberspace digital Silk Road. And they're well on their way to doing that. They're controlling those companies. And what is the impact? They want those companies, if a company has a great deal of success, they want them to share their data. They want them to share with other companies. Think about Jack Ma. Think about Jack Ma. You don't hear about him anymore. Have you read about him? Have you heard him? He used to be all over the place. Built a really successful company, $1 billion company. He's been out for some time. The cyberspace Internet Investment Fund, did they have anything to do with that? Maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe it's all coincidence. But I don't think so. I think that America's in a race of competition to compete with China. We're competing on those areas of technology and innovation. And I think that the Chinese approach is on trying to develop the innovation. And they certainly are rewarding innovation. 2.3 million patents. The United States, 350,000. But is it going to get them to world leadership? I want you to think about something. I want you to picture in your mind. I want you to picture where things are in China. I want you to think about a field, a very cultivated field. Maybe it's lettuce. Think about the rows of lettuce, one row after another, of a farm, of a cultivation. And in that row, if you have weeds, you pluck them out. You want the rows straight. You want them uniform. You want everything to look the same. And maybe you want to grow 2 or 3 or 5 types of lettuce. So you have different varieties of the same product. But they're all, every one, a straight row. All looking the same. All of the same product looking the same. Everything all coordinated. And if there's weeds, you want to pluck the weeds out. You want to get rid of the weeds. Who wants to put weeds in their lettuce? You want everything to conform, and it's to be conforming. I want you to think about another thing, and that's a rainforest. A rainforest where there's dozens of different species. There's a chaotic growth. Nothing grows in straight lines. Everything, there are patches where there's almost nothing. There's other patches which are filled. And they're filled with dozens of different species, one competing with another. And some plants will grow up and overcome and take out some of their competing places. I want you to think of those as we come to this commercial break, because I'm going to talk about those in terms of America versus China. Don't go away. I'll be right back. So before the break, I talked and asked you to picture two things. One, a cultivated field growing lettuce. Straight rows, everything the same, weeds plucked out. And the other picture of a rainforest. All sorts of different species, all chaotic. Where one plant would suddenly grow up and force other plants out of the way, and some of those plants would die. But it would displace those. It would disrupt those. But you had chaotic growth all over. For me, and I took that from a book called The Rainforest, Rebuilding Silicon Valley. How to build Silicon Valley and outside of Silicon Valley. The book's called The Rainforest. So it's really describes what's going on in America. It's something that we're competing in so many different fields, and it's a Chinese approach versus the American approach. And as we go, who's going to win? I mean, the disruptive technology that comes out of America is like the chaotic things. For China, you don't get that. Not in the least. For China, it's going with the examples. Going with the conformity. Conforming to the Chinese philosophy. To the Chinese national security. It's conforming. There's a book that was written bold by Peter Diminsky, and he lays out Peter's rules. And I want to read a few of those because I think it illustrates the rainforest. It's do it by the book, but be the author. If you can't win by the rules, change the rules. If you can't change the rules, then just ignore them. No simply means begin one level higher. Don't walk when you can run. The squeaky wheel gets replaced. An expert is someone who can tell you exactly how something cannot be done. Fail early, fail often, but fail forward. A bureaucracy is an obstacle to be conquered with persistence, confidence, and a bulldozer where necessary. That's the American entrepreneur. When you look at the quirky people who have come along, you look at the quirky guy who thought he could make an electric vehicle that wasn't just for the tree huggers, but for the person who wanted a luxury car. Crazy idea. Quirky guy. Oh yeah, he'd made a lot of money doing PayPal, but he was a quirky guy. And if you listen to some of the people who have been around him, you can tell he's pretty quirky. But you know what? I own a Tesla. It's the best car I've ever had. It's the most interesting car I've ever had. It's almost like a software program masquerading as a car. That's the kind of quirkiness. Or another quirky guy who didn't shower, who was a vegetarian. Very quirky at personal type guy. Had this idea, beginning with computers, started with computers, migrated, had this idea of a phone with apps on the phone. Yeah, Steve Jobs. I mean, those are the quirky kinds of guys. Do you think they would succeed in China under today's regime? Maybe a Jack Ma might. He did. Do you hear from him anymore? No. I mean, the whole focus in the last 5 years is to make everybody into that cultivated row of lettuce. They're going to reward you. They're going to make some innovations. You're going to be able to make some improvements on the lettuce. but you're not going to come up with a new species. You're not going to come up with something that's revolutionary. You're not going to come up and invent kale. You're not going to deviate. You're not going to have the chaotic focus that we find in America. And we're competing on a worldwide basis. I use this time and again. 50% of the sales of American companies come from overseas. Those are the companies in the Standard & Poor's. If you look at all companies in the U.S., 43% of our sales come from overseas. 43%. 50% for the companies in the S&P 500. It's not just competing in America, competing against America. It's not just China competing in China. We're competing in the world. Studies show that 93% of the world's middle class will live in those emerging nations in 2030. Those are people that are consumers. They've moved from subsistence to consuming. I tell the story. I had a client once who was the plant manager for American Standard in Tianjin, China. They built the plant there. They hired 1,000 workers. Of those 1,000 workers, not one had ever seen a ceramic toilet or a ceramic bathtub or a ceramic shower stall when they started that plant. Not one. Let alone use a ceramic toilet or a ceramic bathtub or a ceramic shower stall. Not one of those employees had seen that. Now that was in the late 80s, early 90s. Today those employees have smartphones. They're buying lattes. They buy cars. They get their clothes at the department store. They get their food at the grocery store. They're not growing their own food. They're not making their own clothes. They're not bartering for what they want. They actually earn and they're buying. They're becoming consumers. They've moved from subsistence. They've moved from making $2 a day to making a living wage. And that's happening all over the world now. That's going to continue to happen all over the world. And that's a good part of the people that marketing will grow on. Who do you think is going to win that battle? The cultivated, down the line, companies that are going to be censored to make sure that you don't put anything wrong on your website? Or those companies who view bureaucracy as an obstacle, if necessary, to be bulldozed over with? How often will a Chinese company accept failure? And will they accept fail early, fail often, and fail forward? Think of the people who have done that. Think of the Steve Jobs who failed when he formed Apple and went to Next for his computer and then came back with the Macintosh and then with the iPhone. Are we going to find those people in China? I have doubts. I think they'll make innovations and they'll continue to improve on a lot of products. But will they make the disruptive products? Will they make the dramatic changes? I don't think so. I think that's going to be left to America. But it's not going to be an easy fight. It's not going to be easy. But I think that also points the direction for investments. My personal feeling is investing in Chinese companies is foolhardy. Investing in Chinese companies is investing in Chinese philosophy. I don't think it pays a huge reward. That's just my helpful hint for today. That wraps up my comments on China. I think we win. I'm sure that there's a lot of Chinese people, and I've been told by Chinese people, believe that I'm wrong. We'll see. Until next week, this is Mike Adams. Have a very great weekend, rest of the weekend, and a good week. And next Saturday, I will be back to talk about money.
You've been listening to to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more